Legato is a very important skill in piano playing, one of the most important. The topic is huge, and there is no chance I can cover it within one video because this topic deserves many dissertations, and usually it takes months of mutual work with the student in order to teach them play nice legato. But I nevertheless want to give you some hints, some principal, universal general tips that you might use for starting your research, for starting your development in that direction. I dedicate a great attention to this skill when I work with students, and I actually do teach online. So if you are interested in a personalized treatment, if you would like to have online lessons with me, just check out the link in the description where you can contact me. When we see a slur in the score, a slur over a group of notes, the first thought that many of us might get is that we have to connect these notes with fingers, playing legato, and opposing that touch, that way of playing to, let's say, staccato, when we play everything short and separated. And it's not wrong, but there are a few issues with that, and let me just quickly list them. Let me just quickly make a few claims, and then we start a discussion. So, issue number one. It's not always necessary to provide a physical connection in order to play a beautiful legato. Issue number two. Even if you provide a good physical connection, it doesn't mean that you got a beautiful legato. In other words, physical connection is not enough. And issue number three, sometimes physical connection will only ruin your legato, driving you away from your goal, actually. So, in order to explain what I meant by these claims, let's first ask ourselves, what is legato actually? So if you will see some definitions in Wikipedia somewhere on the web, you might see that legato in translation is connected, and playing legato, we should play everything smoothly and connecting notes. I would say that legato, first of all, it's an audible connection between notes, and if we reach that goal, connecting notes physically, great, then we do a physical connection. If we can get it otherwise, then we don't have to connect them physically, and sometimes we shouldn't connect them physically, and I will analyze such examples in this video. But another aspect, actually even more important in my opinion, and an aspect that is very important for me personally, for my personal approach and my philosophy of piano playing, is that, in my opinion, legato is a skill that helps us to make our listeners forget about a percussive nature of this instrument. Because when you hit a key, what does happen actually? Bang! The hammer hits the string with a violent force. So this is a violent, rough action, and we get a bang. And then we hit another key, another bang. So actually, if I would just play 4 notes in a row, even if I would connect them with fingers, nevertheless, it sounds like bang, 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 bang. And this is absolutely an unacceptable way because to play piano, if we want to play a real legato, because we hear those impulses. So for example, let me demonstrate what I mean on a famous piece by Beethoven, which you of course know, all of you. So for example, I want to start this piece with a beautiful legato. So I connect notes with fingers. How do you think, was it a good legato or not? I would say it's a horrible legato because I had an unnecessary impulse on B. Or, for example, this is not good also because I had an impulse on the last note. So in order to play legato, I would need to shape this phrase in such a way that I would not have any unnecessary impulses. And this involves understanding of phrasing. So phrasing is our key point to playing, to mastering legato, because I can actually play this phrase without providing a finger connection. I can actually play it even like with a pencil, not with fingers at all, using just pedal, my ears, and just providing a nice shape, nice phrasing to this melody. For example. And what is important here is to avoid impulses on strong beats. So after this note, we have 2 very expressive seconds. G sharp, E, G sharp, E. So our task is to play them on rather like micro diminuendo, having more support on D sharp. Of course, D sharp should not be too strong either, but nevertheless, providing this kind of glissando connection. So it should feel very smooth. And then, of course, avoiding accent when we go lower. And, of course, avoiding accent on the last note. Providing as smooth connection as possible. And, of course, then minimizing all these motions in order to make it sound really smooth. So phrasing has an essential role because, as I have already demonstrated before, piano is a percussive instrument. So as soon as you hit the note, it starts making diminuendo, like immediately. And in order to create a singing effect, we have to constantly shape in the line dynamically. Basic rule for that is when melody goes up, we make a crescendo, and when the melody goes down, we make a diminuendo. So for example, if I would have just 4 notes, I would start the first note softly. It's very important to avoid impulse on the first note, especially when you play it with the thumb. The thumb is a very heavy finger, so our task is to dive into the key slowly. Just imagine that your forearm is a feather that falls down very slowly, and the wrist also cushions the shock. And you go with that constant slow speed all the way to the bottom of the key. So the trick here is not to push the key additionally. You just dive with the hand with a constant speed, being absolutely relaxed here, and especially in the wrist. And then after the first note, we start intensifying that line. But the last note, we play smoother. So we create this kind of rounded shape, starting and ending the line smoother. This is valid, of course, if we have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, this kind of rhythmical combination. Pom, 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 pom. If we start from the upbeat, if we start from the stronger beat, like for example 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, then we would start with more support on the strong beat, but avoiding an accent on that beat. It means that I have to play the second note nearly as intensively. Otherwise, we get impulses. In order to avoid that, pom, 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 I neutralize that impulse, playing the second note also a bit louder and softening notes 3 and 4. This is a very important rule, avoiding impulses on strong beats. We have to get rid of that habit as soon as possible, because this is exactly what makes a pianist sound very, very amateur. So, and this is something that I was explaining in my course dedicated to technique, general tips about technique, a comprehensive guide to technique and musicality, with examples on Hanon exercises, and you can check out that course with a lot of useful tips, both about technique and basic rules of musicality, following the link in the description. Then, of course, most of melodies, they have a certain shape. So the melody might go up and then, for example, down. So if we have something like such phrase, we would start and end it softly as well, but we would provide more shape in the middle. And for that, wrist flexibility, shaping melodies with the wrist is a very effective way to play a better legato. So for example, here we start lower, from a lower position of a wrist, dive into the thumb very gently, make a gentle crescendo toward the middle of the phrase, going higher with your wrist, and going a bit lower at the end, smoothing the end. So drawing a circle, a small circle in the wrist. Of course, not exaggerating that motion, but just trying to find a comfortable amount of that motion. So here, for example, finger legato, connection between fingers, physical connection helps a lot, because it helps us to shape the melody. This is a very common shape in music that has such a rounded shape. And very often it should be played legato in most of cases, I would say. And for example, in the Beethoven's Tempest Sonata, in the last movement of it, we have similar story. The melody goes up and then down. So we have a rounded shape. So here is also important to avoid an accent on the thumb, diving into the keyboard very gently, and then shaping it with the wrist. So after the thumb, I raise my wrist a bit and play those middle notes more intensively, and the last note as softly as possible. Otherwise, we might accent those strong beats, for example. And this is the most horrible way to play this piece, and we definitely should not do that, because in that way it sounds very heavy and it sounds very vertical. So we are kind of marking beats. So we have like kind of boxes, box, another box, another box, and it's really very tiring to listen to such performance. That's why we always avoid strong beats, making those middle notes more expressive and smoothening the beginning and the end of the motif. So there is a very simple trick to avoid accents on the strong beats and improve legato in our lines, if we would consider the fact that most of melodies actually in classical music, they start actually not from the strong beat but from the upbeat. And even if when we have a longer line, we nevertheless can break it into motifs that would start from the second 16th note. And this principle was a main feature of Bach, for example. If we would look at his melody, most of them, they start actually from the upbeat. One, dum, bum, 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 bum. One, ta, da, bum, 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 bum. So his motifs, they start from 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And they end on the strong beat. And then we have another motif, 2, 3, 4, 1. Or for example here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And it's very useful to practice pieces like that, first breaking them down into motifs and shaping each particular motif separately. Always remembering that we start and end each motif without accents, without impulses, but we provide more support, more leaning towards piano, more expressiveness in the middle notes. So here, light C, more support on D, E, and lighter F. Pom, 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 ta-da, pom, pom, and so on. So basically, if we would just read the piece like that, it would immediately sound better. Pop, pop, pop. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. So these strong beats are always actually slightly weaker than the middle notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, because the construction of this line is actually having motifs that start from the second 16th note. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. So that's why it would sound immediately much, much smoother if we would think and phrase that way. And of course, shaping them with the wrist. Going down, higher, down. So basically you go lower with the wrist whenever you have more expressive notes. So the first note is lighter, and then we dive a bit deeper, and the last note is lighter, so we go slightly higher. Of course, I'm exaggerating, but actually it's useful to exaggerate it first in a slower tempo, and then minimizing. And then minimizing these movements when you already play a larger phrase. Another very important tip in order to improve your legato is avoiding accents, avoiding impulses when you have a leap. And as an example, let's take a Prelude number 5 by Frédéric Chopin. This is a very tricky piece because it should be played in a quite vivid tempo, but nevertheless with a perfect singing legato, so it should sound incredibly smooth. And that's a problem because in a faster tempo it's difficult to phrase with that ultimate care that I was demonstrating to you before. That's why choosing a tempo, we also have to consider in which tempo we can actually provide an ultimate legato without sounding mechanical. So for example, when we have a line, we have a small range here, so the melody it has a quite narrow range, but then we suddenly have a leap. If we react to this music emotionally, of course we want to express, we feel that the tension grows because the distance between notes increases, and we want to express that somehow. And one of the most frequent things that happened, people accent the upper note, but immediately you have this screaming accent on the top, which sounds quite ugly. In order to kill two rabbits and on the one side show the tension, convey the tension of that leap, but also avoid some straightforwardness here, we have to lean on the lower note in a leap. So here, when I approach that lower D, I would use it as a leaning point and play the upper note actually on diminuendo. And maybe even slightly more time, I would take a little bit of rubato in order to transmit that tension. So, and this is quite a general rule. So whenever we have a leap in melody, it doesn't really matter which one. For example, here, if we would make a straightforward accent on a top note, it would sound not really legato, it would not sound singing enough, but providing a smooth support on the lower note and adding some flexible movement here, shaping that with the wrist might actually sound more expressive. Another very important tip is how we exit long notes, because when we have a long note, it decreases in volume, of course. As soon as we hit it, it starts making diminuendo. And then let's say we have another note sometime later, and it should sound legato. So what happens very often here is that we make an unnecessary accent here. And that accent on G breaks the line, it breaks the smoothness, it breaks that rounded shape that we should somehow get in this phrase. But how do we get it, actually? Here we have to press such a long note with enough support, so enough tenuto. We can't play it too softly because it will die out too quickly, so we play it with a decent support, and then we listen to this sound, how it decreases. We listen to its diminuendo, and the next note that follows, we have to play not louder than what remains of this note. So this sounds like legato. This is already worse. This is bad, you see. So actually, then we have to choose a tempo, because if it will be too slow, then of course this trick would not work. It would be very difficult to provide legato. So here, avoiding impulse on G and playing F sharp with enough support. And then of course, avoiding impulse on the strong beat, because this also would be bad. So and of course, the most important point here is D, because it should be the softest note of the line. So support, no accent, and diminuendo toward the end. And then we have another situation. So here also, in order to play legato, we have to start extremely careful, soft with the thumb, very tender touch, Then using the shape in the arm in order to increase volume here, but then we make diminuendo towards A because the line decreases. So A would be actually the softest note among these, and then we start making a very gradual crescendo, but we smoothen the last leap, because if we would play, it would be too straightforward. So we create that aspiration, we create that feeling of crescendo, but we smoothen the very top of the passage. And this is a great tip for legato in romantic music. When you have an ascending line, you make crescendo all the way to the top, but you smoothen the very top of it. So here. And of course, very careful with such resolutions. Here also, when we have a dotted rhythm here, it might sound too rough, like that, or like that. Both versions are quite bad. That's why we have to free up the hand on the longer note and then approach a shorter note with a free hand, cushioning the shock in the wrist. And of course, very careful resolution that should sound even softer. And this brings us to another very important rule, two notes rule. So whenever we have two notes connected with a slur, in the vast majority of cases, the second note must be played much softer. And it doesn't really matter in which direction or which interval you play. If you have two notes connected with a slur, the first one is played with support, and the second one smoother, especially when we have descending seconds, like here. Providing enough support on the higher note and great diminuendo toward the lower note. And the best way to play such pairs of notes is, of course, to dive right to the bottom of the key, going lower with the wrist, and then the second note is played while you raise the wrist. Same thing when you go upwards. Of course, I'm slightly exaggerating now, but if you would have that line of pairs of notes, when each pair would be connected with the slur, we would play the second note always lighter. A visual plasticity of the arm, wrist motion, of course, is much less important than audible impression. So the audible impression is the most important. But nevertheless, this plasticity may be used to strengthen the audio effect. So a so-called power of gesture. It works great, especially for leaps and octaves, where we can't really provide a physical connection, but we have to somehow provide legato effect. For example, in the Brahms Concerto No. 1, we have some octave passages that should be played legato. However, there is no way we can provide a physical connection. So here, for example, there is no way we can play those leaps providing a physical connection, but we can imitate that legato using pedal, using a careful phrasing, and of course adding some plasticity in the hand just for the visual impression, which actually helps. In addition to a nice phrasing, the plasticity of motion would make a really great impression here. So here, avoiding of course impulses on strong beats, and then that turn is important, so going a bit higher after that note and following the shape of the melody with the wrist might help us to create a better effect. And of course rubato. Of course we would take a bit more time shaping the top of that line. But I would say that finger legato, physical connection, is not that important for already well-trained musicians with a lot of experience, who have already trained their ears and can really provide legato without any finger connection, without physical connection. But for the most of students, physical legato is a necessary step, because just finding a proper shape, as I have demonstrated, might actually already improve legato a lot. That's why for students, I would nevertheless suggest try to develop as much finger legato as necessary, excluding spots where we shouldn't do that, and I will get to this in a moment. And I personally had a teacher who was very strict with finger legato. We were supposed to hold everything. So when we had some long chords or legato lines, we had to provide as much physical connection, as much physical contact with the keyboard as possible. And this has some pros, some really great pros, but it has also some cons. Because on the one hand, it is a great school, it is a great discipline. Because we tend to listen carefully only to those notes that we really hold with fingers. This is a very interesting paradox of piano playing, because when I hold a note and I really hold it with my finger, I keep listening to it. If I just leave it hanging on pedal, I lose concentration on it. And then when I have to build up a line of such notes, most probably I would have some unnecessary impulses, and most probably that would be a quite bad legato. Thinking about physical connection, thinking about being in touch with the keyboard helps us actually quite often to connect sounds better, to form a nice line, to phrase them. And this is a very common problem of students, for example, who have not this discipline, because then they might sound very like bravura-like and not mature enough. For example, let's have a look at the climax part of the Brahms Piano Concerto No. 1. If we wouldn't hold these notes with fingers here, we get a very careless, very bravura-like, mindless performance, which doesn't really provide that tension, that density of the musical material. That's why just holding these notes in the right hand, providing enough tenuto and providing enough physical legato in the left hand, might actually leave just another impression. Sounds more intense, sounds more smoother. So we have this sensation of a very dense material, like a peanut butter river that just goes over you, and you just have to go with the flow, because it's so massive, so dense, and so powerful. And this effect is not possible to reach if you would just jump over the keyboard and release these notes, or not provide enough physical legato. On the other hand, there are a lot of uncomfortable spots in the piano literature that require a lot of stretch and provoke too much tension in hands. And if you try to connect notes physically in such spots, you might get in trouble. So first of all, it might sound bad, because a golden rule of piano playing, if it feels clumsy, it will sound also clumsy. So our goal is, and our task, to make everything we play very comfortable, feel very comfortable. In such spots that are uncomfortable, that are difficult to play physical legato, you should immediately give up on the idea of connecting notes with fingers and relying on your ears, on your phrasing, and of course pedal. So for example, in the same prelude by Chopin, in D major, that I have already showed you a bit today, in the beginning, we have a very comfortable line. So we can provide a decent finger legato. We can rely on our fingers. But then we get some spots where physical legato might be not possible, like here. Like I can't take that, for example. not possible. So if I would try to reach that, if I would try to stretch my hand and reach that physically, and this is what many students do actually, although it seems and it looks absurd, but many students nevertheless would try to like intuitively connect that as much as they can, like here. But of course, in that way you just overuse your hands, and most probably you will get some unnecessary accents. So what we have to do here is immediately give up on the idea of connecting that with fingers and relying solely on the pedal and just making sure that we don't have any unnecessary impulses. Smoothing everything and just controlling that with our ears and using pedal and phrasing for providing legato here. Or for example, in the ballade by Chopin number 4, there are a lot of spots that should sound really legato, but it's nearly impossible to provide a physical legato, because that would kill your hands rather. So here, for example, in this spot, we have to disconnect, we have to rely on pedal. There are some people who try to reach it, but it just brings a lot of tension, and most probably you will just sound clumsy. So what we would do here is release the hand, go inside the keyboard, releasing the hand, and then leaning on that note from above. Then, of course, forming pairs first, mastering these motifs in pairs. And again, the first pair is always played on the pull-in motion out of the keyboard, and the second one in the keyboard. So back, forward, like that. Like that. And then you just cover it with pedal, and frequently changing pedal, you provide that smoothness. Then, of course, there are different types of legato. I have already mentioned that in my course about Mozart sonata, I think it was. That in classical music, when we play faster, especially when we play faster passages like 16 notes, it's really great to control that you release each finger immediately when you hit the next finger. So this would be a rather classical legato here. When notes don't overlap. But in a romantic legato, that is more suitable for romantic music, or maybe for some slower movements of Mozart or Beethoven. In romantic legato, you would let sounds gently overlap. So that would be a romantic legato, because I first hit the next note, so you see, this is a slow version, yeah? So you first hit the next note and then you release the previous one. This is a principle how to play a romantic legato that is suitable for many romantic spots, many lyrical spots, because it smoothens, like when you have this cross dissolve in the footage, you know, when the frames don't change immediately, but when they kind of blend. This is the same effect that we can create improving our legato. But again, it's more suitable for romantic music. In the classical music, we tend to have more clarity, more crispiness. Then another very interesting topic that I would like to bring to your attention is other different functions of slurs that we see in the score. Because sometimes legato might be a warning, actually. A warning, for example, of not doing much, as it happens, for example, in the second ballade by Frédéric Chopin. We have a huge legato line over many bars. And this legato is not just telling us that it should sound smooth, it tells us also that we should not play this music too expressively, that we should not bring too much smaller phrasing here. Yeah, so here, so this serenity and and this is one phrase, so it should feel very serene and very smooth. And this line points out that we should not bring too much. That we should not play it very intensively, because character that we have to convey is something very extremely tender, intimate, and a rather very dreamy, like irreal picture. That's why we would resist to bring too much expressivity here. And for such pieces, when we have to create legato here in this line that is always so rhythmically precise, it's very useful also to avoid impulses on the stronger beats, shifting the support toward the upbeat. So this upbeat would be gently, like a little bit more intensive than the strong beat itself. So you have to think not like pum 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 pum. This is a wrong way to play this piece, because you see, I sit on each beat and it sounds immediately very boring, like very tired, like a 100-year-old man, you know, who is always not happy about everything, and so, you know, bored to death and so on. Instead, we have to think from the upbeat. Pum 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 padam tadam tayam padam taya. So just imagine 3-1, 3-1, kind of diminuendo towards the strong beat, feeling this music rather from the upbeat. But then, of course, minimizing that expressiveness, again, in order to make it not too short, in order to make it feel not in beats, but very long. Here we are allowed to breathe with the hand, but only with the right hand. So, and again, not much expressiveness, and also a tie, always smoothing And another tip, the last tip that I would like to share with you is that there are different types of slurs. So there are articulation slurs, like for example in this Brahms concerto. We have smaller articulation slurs that show us that we have to play these pairs of notes following phrasing rules. So we have a leaning point on the first one, playing it with more support, and the second one is lighter, and then another pair. And then two notes separate. And on the other level, we have another slur, and this is a phrasing slur. It shows us that we nevertheless should play it as one phrase. So this is kind of a dialectics in piano playing. On the one hand, we have to show, on the one level, we have to show articulation. On the other level, we have to unite this. And of course, we make it with dynamics, making crescendo toward the middle of the phrase and smoothening the end. Sometimes composers write only articulation slurs, but following the logic of music, it's evident that a phrasing slur also should be present somehow here. Like, for example, in this beautiful valse by Tchaikovsky. Actually, this album for the young by Pyotr Tchaikovsky is a great book for intermediary pianists. It contains a lot of very famous pieces that you will recognize immediately, and it's a really useful book for intermediate, late beginners, early advanced players. There are pieces of very different levels, so take a look on that if you don't know this book. And there is a valse that sounds like. So here what we have three motifs. We have to separate each motif. But we nevertheless feel that this is actually, those are three motifs, but they form one phrase. So we would not be wrong if over those articulation slurs, we would also write a phrasing slur, like that would unite all three of them. And that would make clear that we nevertheless have to shape all this melody as one phrase, providing a crescendo toward the higher part of the motif and smoothing the end. I hope that this was helpful. I hope that you have learned a lot of new things for you. Please check out my comprehensive tutorials dedicated to individual pieces and to general technique principles on teachable.com. Please contact me for an online lesson if you want to get some, and have fun playing piano.